Park Service to let us replicate it. This is a case of actual reconstruction because the original construction was kind of experimental at the time, and then when in the 70s and 80s, when they insulated everything, when the energy first got expensive, it caused the dew point to hit the one point in the wall, and it was rusting all brackets off that were holding the panels in place.
Yeah, I remember when they did that. I was actually going to Lansing Community College at the time when they were they took the facade off and then cleaned it and put it back on.
This is a state-of-the-art rain screen.
And I got to go in there too after they did that. It was so cool.
What was the type of material that they used when they redid it?
It's painted metal panels.
Okay.
And it's actually a rain screen, so that the real water barrier is behind it, and the insulation is behind it, and it's really just for the looks. And then we were able to replicate the look and the color and all that kind of stuff. And the only thing
So
that's original,
cool.
there's little medallions that have K on them. We can take those off. All the rest of it. This is so historic characters. So you should retain the historic character of the building, and don't remove characteristics of the building that cause it to have that character. And here's a good example of what happens when you do that. So you want to avoid altering significant features, or removing significant features. That's obvious. And then it's, what is the character of the building? And sometimes it's really obvious. And it might vary from building to building. It might vary from buildings within the neighborhood. It will generally. So you have to look at each building, because one of the real tempting things for people to do is, especially for a while when they were tearing down so many buildings in Detroit, there were all these historic pieces available. It's like, oh, I want to use this historic piece on this building. And well, it doesn't really belong on that building. So you really have to kind of understand the styles and what's going on in terms of what's appropriate. Fortunately, downtowns are a little bit easier, except for when it comes to buildings. Again, the character is going to vary by building type and details. And sometimes the character is very simple. This is again Ypsilanti. I lived in Ypsilanti a lot of times when I was in slides. Is that this isn't a street of mansions, and yet you have this little
blue house. Yeah.
Yeah, the little talking about it's a townhouse, because there was a 50-year battle to save this building in Ypsilanti, and it's finally almost ready to be occupied again. And we'll talk more about that later. And sometimes, the character includes the site, and what does it feel in the site, and how does it feel in the site. Historic accuracy. Each property should be recognized as a physical record of its time, and changes that occurred over time become part of that record. So he was talking about his house, but it's not unusual to have, and this is, and the other side of that is you don't want to put conjectural features on buildings now. So this was obviously a nice little bungalow, and somebody wanted to turn it into terra, and that's not what we want. On the other hand, buildings do change over time. So this is the same house, and originally it was a pretty simple federal house, and then probably my guess is a fairly early change with that bay window, and then somebody gussied it up.
Yeah, the doghouse looked on the top.
Yeah, and so the changes that have been there for a really long time, like that bay window, generally we say that's part of the record of the house, and you want to keep them. But what you want to avoid is then when they start making false history of the building was never like that. I've never seen it, but you have to look at what is the character of that building, because sometimes that is the character of the building. And it may be that the original house has integrity, and you don't worry so much about the additions. Because you kind of have to deal with what's there. So here's a downtown, which is the building. And when I started in preservation was the late 70s and the early 80s. And people, that was only as attitudes were really just starting to switch about, old buildings are interesting. Because before that, there was this real denial. We don't want them. We want to tear them down. We've got to have them. We've got to make them like we want them now. And this is the colonialization of Michigan downtowns epitomized in this particular building. Clearly, that's not what we want. On the other hand, you have buildings that have really good mascots. This is really useful. So I'm going to go into it again, where around World War II, I think they did this right after World War II in the 50s, They put down these panels, and we were really hoping that the original terracotta was still there. They changed the windows, and they wanted to do this as a historic building because they wanted the tax credit. Fortunately, we had this photograph, and it was an Albert Kahn building. We also had the drawings. Albert Kahn's really good about
The Garfield building.
the drawings. So we could replicate it, knowing that we were reconstructing it the way it was. The windows operate differently because those big windows on the first floor pivoted. And they don't pivot now, they just go on and the material that we use, and we'll talk more about that, is actually fiberglass panels. It's not terracotta, because they couldn't afford to do it with terracotta. But the building has the character that it had historically. And so, again, under rehabilitation, this is totally acceptable. The significant thing is that buildings change over time. And changes that occur get their own significance. So here you have a little stick style, probably 1880s house with a clearly probably about 1900 porch. So it's not original to the building, but it's been there for 100 years. It's now part of the building, and you want to keep that. We actually did have a discussion with the owner on this one who wanted to take it off. It's like, no.
Now, can you stop them from doing that?
Yes. If it's in a historic district, you can.
Wow.
Yeah. And you have control over what they do the outside of the building, as long as you're requiring them to do things that are within the city.
And that's what I was gonna say, because potentially this town, it has to be, what, 60 years for it to be considered? 50 years? So potentially a large portion of this town could be considered for...
Well, you can, yeah, the ranches are now could be historic. You have to designate within your town what's important to the town. And that will vary from town to town. Ipsy has a pretty big district because it has its downtown, it has depot town, and it has this kind of core residential area. It could have even more. It basically protected what was endangered. So it really depends. This is a kind of change over time, which is about style. And style, architecture is like fashion. It changes. Every 10 years the styles are, I can go around the state and I can tell you within 10 years what every building before 1900 was built. Because there's just this,
Yeah.
and that changes over time. So when I started, which was in the late 70s, the stuff that was in the 50s and stuff that's less than 50 years old, especially stuff that's 25 years old, the current generations always think it's garbage. It's just part of, that's passé, that's what I grew up with, that's what my parents like. I don't like that. And so you have to be really careful because actually these Art Deco storefronts are really cool. And now, another 50 years later, we start to really appreciate them and go, oh, this is really cool. It's part of what makes our town interesting. So I think that's also when you're looking at new construction, you really want to encourage compatible new stuff that is of the current era, but that fits. And that can be done. And I would have a whole lot more slides about that. Something done a little homework. And so I think that's the thing to watch out for, is that what you're trying to do is protect what's old and let what's new be new, but be new within the setting. And so, what's important? The building sits on the sidewalk, and it has a largely open first floor, and it has a rhythm of the windows on the upper floor. Beyond that, let it be modern, So this is another one where building, and this is one actually this whole thing about when is it significant. So it's a building in Bay City. It's a bank. It's still a bank when the developer bought it. But in the 60s, they spent a lot of money to make this mid-century modern. And this is very classic mid-century modern. And the inside was done the same thing. They moved where the support columns were. They put a big, huge beam in, carrying all that masonry up. It's all still there because they wanted to make sure those columns were exactly spaced. And
I've seen the article on this. I don't know if it was from MLive, but yeah, they definitely did this to a lot of buildings around the state.
Yes, it was full of it. But this was a particularly good, and I was afraid that the Park Service, which this was text that I thought was gonna make us keep. I said, the first thing we gotta do is make sure they're gonna let us change it. But this is where the Historic District Study Report is really important, because the date of the end of the period of significance for this downtown was, I think, 36 or something, 1936. So this was built after the period of significance. So by definition, you can change it. That's why what your district is defined as is really important. And when I said on the review board at the state that reviews all the National Register nominations coming through, there were a couple of them that sent the district so late that they were protecting really bad alterations to buildings. I said, you really don't want to do that. You really want to set it 10 years earlier, unless there's a real reason you want to protect those, because you're going to build Park Service and they're not going to let you restore those facades. So this one, we were really lucky. This was behind the grill. I thought it was still there. So the first floor was messed up, big time, really the first 2 floors. But the upper floors were there. And because they had been protected for the last 50 years, it was actually in pretty good shape. And so we snuggled with the design based on there were 2 periods of it. It had been changed once significantly, like in the 20s. Managed to get something that, again, the lower part is all fiberglass panels, not actually stone. But it looks like stone, feels like stone. Just don't knock on it.
So they, in the 1960s remodel, they ripped all that out? All the stone at the lower end?
Yeah, it's all gone.
What?
They put in these massive beams to carry it. And so we managed to, and we couldn't redo the structure. It wasn't, so we modified the design so we could get it. And it's now apartments on the lower floor of the restaurant.
So now the 1960s beams and stuff are still in there?
They're there. And that requires some modifications of design. Distinctive features, construction techniques, examples of craftsmanship should be preserved, shall be. And that'll be a lot of different things that again, 50 years ago, everybody wanted to get rid of it. Now everybody said, oh, that's cool, we're going to have my building. One of the things that is two things that might be masonry, which has gotten much better, because there was a long time when every mason is convinced that the harder the mortar, the better, and mortar is glue. Well, neither things are true. You really need to make sure that they're using the right kind of mortar. It's a lime-based soft mortar, because the stuff you buy from ready mix will destroy bricks. You'll see some pictures of that in a minute. The other thing is, if it's not painted, the Park Service won't let you paint it. It's not a good idea. Right now, black buildings are the current thing, you know. So it's like, but if the brick's there, leave the brick. If they want to strip it, the real problem with stripping it, you'll see that in a minute. It will come back in a minute. Exterior trim, the original trim is in place. Keep it. This is a building I actually did really early in my career, and they kept the trim, but they since then put the wrong windows in it. So I pulled this picture off the internet the other day. And that's the windows. But the storefronts, a lot of that was there. A lot of it we could replicate from the photos in terms of what it looked like and how it works. And one of the real challenges I find with these downtown buildings is signage, because there's this kind of thing, anti-signage in historic districts. But when you look at the historic photographs, there were signs everywhere, and they were ugly as they are now. They weren't backlit, you know, channel letters, but they could be pretty loud and clear. So what I do find is that we use the aesthetic thing. We're going to let you put signage to this, but it's got to be aesthetically appropriate. If exterior pieces are missing, you cannot force them to put them back. If they put something back, again, they should be doing something that's appropriate to that building. And if you can't find actual photos of that, although downtowns are tend to be photos, you should make sure you're doing something that really is appropriate to that style. Because again, it's fashion, and it changes over time. What these cornices look like, you know, I can date them within 10 years. You know, you have to really try and understand your downtown enough, and be able to work with your applicants enough to let them know what's appropriate for your downtown. And then there's color. This is deeper. And when I started, it was like, oh, you gotta know. It's paint. Once it's painted, it's paint. It's style, it's gonna change. And if you look at the historic color books, they changed every 10 years then, too. It was a different style. There is, however, some buildings like, the classic little Greek temples that shouldn't be green and blue. There are colors or buildings where the color is inherently part of their character. And there I would start to say, you should be letting them own painted their proper color. But they're downtown buildings. They change over time, they will continue to change over time. And I don't get too fussy about that. Again, when you're doing historic features on buildings, you should do them the way they were done. And I thought this guy was going to lose the tax credits over this, because historically, those corners is torn the corner and stopped. And he insisted on taking it all the way through. And I can't remember whether he lost him or not. I know it was a battle. Because, again, what would it have been historically is prettying up the building in a way that it wouldn't have been historically. So, and then there's windows. They are really important. Especially downtown. Downtowns are about windows, storefronts, and masonry. And windows are really important. And the window industry has gotten better, but we'll talk more about windows in a bit. And then there's construction techniques. So this is where how they were originally built and how they were falling off, and we rebuilt them. But we actually kept some of the panels out of the lower part of the building where they wouldn't fall on people down below knee height, so that there is some record of what it was, because it's actually kind of interesting the way they built it. And so we didn't get rid of actually 100% of it, just really close to 100% of it, because it was really not safe. And then there's craftsmanship. And when we go to buildings, there's a Temple Bethel on Woodward in Detroit. They are now turning into a community center as part of a hotel development. And they basically drive it on the first floor of the building in the 60s and tore off stuff like this. I mean, it's gone. Or it's got big holes gashed into it. I'm always happy when it's like the building in Bay City that they just kind of attach it and it's in front of the building, but that's not always the case. People really do stupid things. Deteriorated features, repair rather than replace. Again, within reason. With rehab, it's within reason. I have done much more replacing than repairing because I've been dealing with buildings in really bad shape. But if they're in good shape, you want to try and keep them. Here's an example of some veteran repairs. Somebody's really piddling. But again, you can't replace this wood because the stuff they build it with is not as good. It will be harder to keep it from rotting in the future. And we're looking at saving these buildings, not for 50 years, but forever. They're for your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to see. So the quality of the materials really matters. And to the extent that you can keep the original materials because they really are better, you're better off.
Well, if they have if you have to replace pieces of wood, could they be treated or?
Well, treated doesn't hold paint as well. And it's generally not as smooth. It's not the same. And does the treatment really hold up over time? Or does it deteriorate over time? Again, you're not looking at a 10-year time frame, you're trying to look at a 50-year time frame. And we don't know. With a lot of these chemicals and stuff they're putting in the buildings, we have no idea. I'm really curious with structure, because structures are all now about glue. And what are they going to be saying in 100 years? I don't know. In a way, I don't care. I'm not going to be here, but when it comes to these historic buildings, we do care. The other thing that we run into is slate roofs. And they're good for about 100 years, depending on the quality of the slate. And then they're not good. And then if they can't afford it, we tend to say do something that has texture, the better quality shingles and stuff. Because you got to be reasonable too. We'll talk about financial hardship later. We do a lot of replacing. These were columns on the Ferry Street project. These are actually plastic, and they're almost identical to the original one, and they hold up just fine.
What were the original ones made out of? Wood?
Yeah, they were all sorts of wood. This building, which is part of the Ferry Street project, all the buildings had alarm systems on them. And they came in at night, and there was a raft of this happening in the city at the time where they were stealing the porches, columns off the porches. Cut the thing, stole all the columns off the porch, and there was a porch for them.
Oh my goodness.
Is that Detroit?
You got to be kidding. This was,
They took the columns, not the carpet.
no, I took the columns.
We probably took that too.
Oh, yeah, there wasn't any copper where they could reach it. And then, there was this woman who worked for me, belonged to a church in Royal, and she said, you know, I think that one of the women in our church runs an antique shop. I think she passed. And she did. And so we went to the police were not interested. So we bought them back. It wasn't all of them, but some of them they were already cut up, and used them as models and recast them.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we would have never been able to do it if we had gotten lucky enough by being able to buy those back. Because those are really cool. And these are now actually plaster sitting on wood shafts. But I was worried that they'd hold up. This opened in 2001.
Where was that house?
Fair Street, just north of the DIA, Detroit. So then there's the repair versus replace on windows. So the first thing that, if you're going to do a tax credit project, you really got to document that the windows are not salvageable. So you do a survey of every window, every piece of every window, what kind of condition it's in. And the other thing that if you are going to replace windows, and this is what's really important, is that they need to have the same sight line. So you have the details of the original windows, exactly how big and wide these pieces are, and then the details of the new windows. When I started, the window industry was not doing it. There are now a number of companies that specialize in doing it, so they get much closer and they're much better. Then, does it still make sense? And we've done the economic study on a number of buildings, and there's like a 70-year payback. Oh, it's going to be this much more energy efficient, blah, blah, blah. And you start to run the numbers, it doesn't make sense. So I did a building in Detroit as an architect involved in this one. And we had to do it really fast. And the windows weren't bad. So we restored them. We took them out, totally stripped them, totally weatherproofed them. They're beautiful. Put on the most expensive storms I could buy. And I lived in the building. I hated those windows because they were cold. It's not low-E glass for one thing. I've been living with low-E glass in a new house, and low-E glass is really has a lot to be said for it. They still leak, even though we had done all that. We really did it right. And so I have real mixed feelings about it. The real killer was I bought storms where they weren't triple track storms, they were just double track. It would cost $20,000 to get the windows washed in this building. I mean, and I had not anticipated that. And I know when they do studies, they'll take that into account. So you really have to look at it. You have to really consider what the building's going to be used for and how you're going to use it. On the other hand, I had my office in an old Greek revival building in Italy for a long time, and it had perimeter heat. Windows were fine. You know, this one we did not put perimeter heat in it, and that was probably the mistake. It would have probably been okay with perimeter heat.
Could you put a modern window behind the original to make it energy efficient, but keep the original there for aesthetics?
The problem with that is it actually turns then the window into a storm, which is much harder on the window because of condensation and stuff. You're better off putting a storm window on the outside. I probably would have been okay if I, number one, had the right kind of heat in the building, and number two, if if I put in triple track, it's just easier to get out and clean the window. So I sold it as condos, and I said, pick one window per room to open and never open the others so that the insides don't get dirty because you don't want to have to pay to clean them. And they're all happy. So the next thing is be gentle. If you're going to use chemical or physical treatments to clean the building, no blasting, period. Outside of just don't blast, don't go there. If you're going to use chemicals, you really need to test. This is why you don't blast brick. Old brick is like a loaf of bread. It's hard on the outside, it's soft on the inside. And once you take that soft layer, or hard layer off, it's going to fall apart. And so you really need to protect that. Again, the industry has gotten much better. When we started, everybody was sandblasting. And now pretty much people know you don't sandblast. Some of the chemicals are very harsh. They can still take it off.
You don't water jet it
You
either.
can do a lot of damage with water.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, 60 psi max. They want 600. And you have to watch them. You can't trust these guys. And sometimes you just need to not strip it. What's that?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you have any experience with the new use of dry ice for media blasting?
It's the same thing. If it's taking off material,
Yeah.
and you can see it because you see the orange of the brick on the ground,
Still too damaging.
it's too damaging.
Yeah.
Because you think, oh, we're going to do this every 50 years. Well, you know, and you don't know how soft the brick is. And so you have to really be careful. This was a house that was probably heated from the beginning. And they stripped it. It's in Ypsilanti. Ypsilanti's pretty strict about what they let people do. And this is as good as it gets. And we have that with a lot of the buildings downtown where they try and strip them. And I just warn people, it's not going to be perfect. Over time, the rest of that paint will flake off. It may take 15 years. So do you want to live with it? So you have to really consider about, is it worth trying to strip it more frequently?
Well, not only that, but stripping it might strip the glazing if there is any.
Yes, yeah. Although glazed brick tends to hold up better. That's a little bit later, it's a little bit harder. 1900 is really when brick starts to get harder. And then it's a little more resilient. Again, this is a chemical testing, and you really see that they were managing it. And this was just cleaning out years of dirt. Actually, I think this house, this particular house, looks better with the darker brick than it would be if they made it bright orange again. Hopefully, you don't need to look past it. Archaeology, if you happen to find it, you got to take care of it. Unfortunately, we don't have to deal with it much. I'm on the Missing Network board now. There's a couple of archaeologists, and I'm learning a lot about archaeology.
Whoa, could you go back to the last one? What was that?
One of the blast furnaces up north where they were doing, in the UP, where they were doing mining.
Oh, Calumet, I think.
Yeah. Design and new additions. And they can't destroy what's there historically, and they should be differentiated and compatible to your question. You don't want it to be, you don't want it, you can't tell the difference. And there's a lot of flexibility here and a lot of judgment here. And it's one of the hard things, one of the more controversial things. What I found over the course of my career is that the Park Service has gotten much more conservative. They want the buildings they want the additions to disappear. The additions can't have any character on them. It depends on the building, and you know, so you don't know what to do.
Yeah, like if you did that to my house, I wouldn't have a house.
Yeah. So here's an nifty example. This is outside of the historic district, which you really don't want to do. This is not compatible. It overwhelms the house. On the other hand, this is a very old house on the road outside of Ann Arbor, and that's going to be a kitchen addition, very compatible. You know, smaller, picks up similar detail, but it's not exactly the same details. If you're a real historian, with things like the barge board doesn't, not a big bag board around it. The details are just slightly different, so you know that it's not really historic. This is downtown Ann Arbor, where the back building is new. I think it's a really, really nice building, in addition to the building in the front. So you have a really very typical Italian downtown building, and very much contemporary building that fits.
They drop a modern building onto an old building.
Oh, well, I disagree with you there.
That is.
And this one's really nice because they set back, there's a differentiator between the two buildings. We'll call that an elbow between the buildings, and that really works. The massing that the cornice line comes through, there's regular windows, but they're different, the punch windows, but they're different. And I've always really particularly liked this one.
Yeah, because Because see, I'm saying that when they put in a new addition like that, it should at least complement the old structure, not be completely different like that.
In this particular case, they look like two different buildings,
Right.
which is okay, because there's also a scale of the buildings in these downtowns. They're not massive. That's one of the problems with what we're building now in the pseudo downtowns. The buildings are too massive, because there was a lot size, and you have 2 or 3 or 4 lots. Rarely more than that you get a building that's more than 6 lots wide. And they're also only so deep, and when they get deeper, they get smaller. And so there's a texture to the size of the buildings, and this does that. If they had just replicated that, even done a simpler version of it going back, the scale would have been wrong, the texture would have been wrong, the rhythm would have been wrong. But yeah, this is another downtown building. We did lose the tax credits over this one. But this looks like something landed on top of the building. It's not compatible.
Yeah, they put a spaceship on top of it.
It's not compatible. And they did lose it. The other thing is that reversibility. That if you're going to do something, it would be nice if you could reverse it and still have the original historic building intact. Sometimes reversibility is something you wouldn't think. So here's somebody who made clearly an inappropriate change to their building way back, but it was reversible. They had photographs, they could take it down, they could put it back like it was, and again, this is really reconstruction of a part of the building. This is a school in actually Washington, D.C., where they put a really large addition. You can see in some of the same characteristics, not just what that one would just look at, where they break down the mass difference. There's a connector between the two, and they're compatible but different. You can see that it's different. But you can see how the two touch each other. That you can pull this off, but that's not.
But see, I don't mind compatible but different. I just don't like it when they put like modern glass on a brick, but like make it drastically different. You know what I mean?
Of course it is doing that.
I'm trying to remember their schools. We had one in Linden when they tore it down. I know where I grew up in Keto Harbor.
Yeah.
And there were a bunch of people.
Yeah, I know about the Keto Harbor one.
Yeah, and then Walled Lake
Yeah.
Junior High, which was the old high school.
Yeah.
I mean, the people are losing that through, I guess, growth.
Yeah, and that's where, you really can make choices in terms of how you grow. And there are ways to grow and change, like you saw the house, all over the state, housing all over the country,
Right.
schools make really good housing. They're really easy.
They did that in Corona.
Yeah.
They turned their old school building into an apartment complex.
Yeah, it's happening a lot. There's really no reason to tear down school buildings. And there is a whole thing about embodiment. That again, the payback, when you tear down a building, new building, is over 100 years before you get the value back of the extra energy you have to put in materials to build a new building, to tear down a building and buildings. From a carbon standpoint, it makes always sense, not always, but most of the time makes sense to reuse the building. Find a way to reuse it, and buildings are flexible. And then there's obviously the things this is like arguing over that. This is kind of awful. It is reusable. And it works, It's really good about it. So what you do is you either give them a certificate of appropriateness and let them do what they want to do, or you work something out with it, or you deny it, or you give them a notice to proceed. We'll talk about when you can do that, or you postpone it. What is really important as a district is that you follow the guidelines in the act, because it gives you like 60 days or something, I don't remember what the timing is, to act. If you don't act within that time frame, they got automatic approval, they can do whatever they want. And if they don't give you enough information, you have to tell them, and you have to tell them in writing. If you don't tell them in writing, you didn't tell them. So we want more information, you need to tell them what information. We consider your application incomplete, therefore the clock is not ticking. You need to tell them. If you turn them down, you need to notify them in writing within the time period that it says in the act, or you'll lose on appeal. They can do whatever they want. So you do have to pay attention to the act. Now again, I don't know how you guys are operating here because you're in such an old district, but I would really look into that, because that's what's defendable in Michigan, is what's in that act, that it's in your ordinance. So if the board meets the secretary of the interiors and any guidelines that you may have established, give them a certificate of appropriateness and they go ahead and do their thing. If you deny them because they didn't meet the standards, not because you didn't like it. You have to say how they didn't meet the standard. And we recommend saying which standards they didn't meet. It's not compatible, they didn't repair it because it was repairable, and actually say what the standards are that you're trying to bring down, because that's defendable in court under PA 169. Applicants can always come back and change. I know most districts that I work with, they try and work something out. Because you want people to be happy. But again, you're standing between two buildings and being lost forever. They can appeal. They appeal to the Historic Conservation Review Board. And how that works, it actually goes to an administrative law judge. They make a recommendation to the review board, and the review board either approves or doesn't approve that. And the administrative law judges don't know anything about preservation. So they will not second guess your judgment. They will second guess your process. You got to make sure the process.
I'm gonna have to take off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Appreciate it.
A notice to proceed is the workaround. The work doesn't meet the standards, but there are reasons why it should go ahead anyway. And those reasons are the building is a hazard to the public. Now, I can find a structural engineer that can say almost every building, these historic buildings. So you have to use your judgment. There are many buildings that I worked on in Detroit that should have been torn down. There's no question about it. Are they still salvageable? Yeah. Should they be salvaged? I don't know. This one, actually, Quinn Evans did a report on it, and it was pretty bad. And so the local commission did let it go down. This is what got built in this place, which is full, it's occupied, the people who earn money and pay taxes. It's got a great restaurant on the first floor.
Were there any in Detroit that were replaced that shouldn't have been? Or I mean,
Torn down? Oh, yeah. You're asking the wrong person. Yeah. You're asking the wrong person.
I have a question. If the interior of a building is deemed unsafe or a hazard, for instance, if it was mold infested, would that be grounds to issue notice to proceed?
These are fixable problems.
Yeah.
You know, and we'll get to financial hardship in a minute because that really comes from financial hardship. The other reason is that the buildings are standing in the way of a major improvement project. In this case, it was senior housing. Actually, I'm sure it was somebody else's slide. And then it's a judgment call. Could it be built someplace else? We got hospitals lining up half of Marshall, and the people in the historic district are terrified because they know these buildings are coming down for parking lots and hospital buildings. Yeah, that's in the best interest of the community, but it's not. You know, is it? You know, could they be building someplace else? So again, there's a judgment call here. Ann Arbor certainly, or U of M certainly tearing down one in Ann Arbor.
yeah, that's kind of what bothers me when you have big companies come in and.
Yeah, well, sometimes it's universities, institutions are not necessarily good neighbors. So here's the townhouse again. So when I went to IFSI in '78, they had pulled the fast one on the church. The house belonged to the church. It's the oldest house in the original foundation in Washtenaw County. Oldest house in 1828. Very, very early. And it's on a street of mansions, but it's this really, really old house. And so it belonged to the church. They were having trouble renting it, and they were getting, it's also right at the edge of the student district. And there was just too much activity there, and they wanted to be done with it, just put it in a parking lot. And some local people got together and said, we'll take care of it for you, we'll rent it for you, and they rented it with their buddies, and everything was fine, and in the meantime, they got the historic district in place. And then they come back 4 years later to tear it down. No. Literally a 50-year battle. And the city stood behind it, and they were in court, out of court. And finally, They agreed to do a long-term lease with the local, the townhouse board, with the local historical society. And they agreed to tear down all the additions at the back and only keep the original house. And they eventually sold it to them. And they said, we can't use it for housing. It has to be office or something because we have so much problem with housing. So we finally convinced them that it's the greatest tiny house. Sometimes the counties have programs to protect them. Well, I should tell you that. So anyway, so this house is now, the carpenter's working on it is 94 years old. This guy is phenomenal. And then some other people work on it. It's going to be done. It's a wonderful little one-bedroom house. And they'll probably sell it. Yeah. But it was a decision made, by leaders in the community that this building is important. It was the original mayor lived here, those kinds of things. It's really cool. It's a very charming little house. And, but only real dedication to people, what was it saying? Economic hardship. So economic hardship is one of the loopholes. But, here, I got it all here. You have to justify it. And it can't be self-inflicted, which it often is, like lack of maintenance, self-inflicted. And it must be a characteristic of the property, not of the owner. Just because you can't afford the building doesn't mean you get to tear it down. If you can't afford it, sell it.
And that happened in Fenton with the old Baptist missionary building. The person wanted to tear it down, and they said no, and it was neglected for years, and the weather tore it down.
Well, and the other thing you can't look at, you can actually stop that too. So it's this is hard for people to go. It's just too expensive for me, and it's a hard pill to swallow. But the state enabling legislation allows you to protect the building, and selling it is a potential one of the remedies. There are buildings that really are. It is a characteristic of the building. I don't think this is a building, but there is a YMCA in Detroit that I've looked at 3 times over the last 50 years, and it's just not a doable project. It's got too many stairs, and it's too weird, and I know you can't do it. Even when you throw loads of stuff at the end, you can't do it. And people want to do it because they have this attachment to the building. I think, this is one that's just not going to work. So sometimes it really is a characteristic of the building's just so odd or it's such bad shape.
What if the building's owned by a church?
Doesn't matter, that house was owned by a church.
And then for a notice to proceed, is there a time limitation on that? Is that approval, if it was issued, only effective for a certain amount of time?
Every approval is tied to the building permit, so as long as your building permits are good, which is usually a year.
So if there's no building permit, would they have to come back for approval if it's been a couple of years?
Yeah, you want to make that clear. Usually the applications are part of the building permit process. So you're giving a notice to proceed, which allows them to give the building permit and building permits. And they then go pull the building permit. That's not clear in the law, so that you need to be clear in your decisions that you're notifying them so you don't end up, he said, she said, waiting. And then it's a deterrent to a major improvement program. So this is when they put in the new Comerica Park, they tore down a lot of buildings. They moved some buildings too, but this was the old YMCA downtown. And, was that worth the trade-off? Probably. But that's, again, a judgment.
Yeah, it's always fun when they move buildings.
Oh, yeah.
Tyrone Township just moved their hall back onto the property that they own. And I know, speaking of Detroit, there was the old, it was like an Anglican church, Mariners, the old Mariners Church.
They moved Mariners Church. They moved the John Theater off of this site.
And so that was kind of interesting.
And generally, the things that are the best, like road improvements, there are things that just have to happen. But there's a judgment call also. It doesn't have to be here, there's the right road. There's processes that go, how poor the building is, what they're altered. The highway that goes through the historic district in Petoskey, I think it's 31 or something, they keep wanting to widen it because it's not wide enough for the traffic, but that district is too important. The traffic jam, it's something. Then there's the townhouse, not the townhouse, the Thompson building in this is in Depot Town. It was one of the older buildings, it's from the 1860s. It was used as a barracks for the troops when they were getting devoted to the Civil War. Long history. And then it was owned by decades by the worst landlord in town. And he just packed it full of stuff. And there was one, this wall. I used to not like, really like to drive by it, but you could see it bulging. And there was a big crack. And I said, this is... So they went after him for demolition by neglect. And fought with him and fought with him and fought with him. And then he did something on another property, dumped sewer in the river, and ended up in jail. And the city took over it. The city has the right, under the ordinance, you have the right to go in and make necessary repairs or reverse things that you've done that's wrong, and then you put as a lien against the property. The truth of the matter, it doesn't happen very much because you don't want to have that happen. But they didn't manage to get this away from them. They gave it to a developer, a young developer, and as he's in it, starting to do work, they burned down the entire building. It was arson. Some employee got mad at him. I was like, oh, fuck. Now what do you do? So this is this thing. I mean, it literally is only the shovel to build it. But it's a really important building. They found some more money, and they got a different developer eventually, and now it's apartments on the upper floor, restaurant on the first floor.
What town is this?
Ipsy,
Ypsilanti.
40-year back. You know, they take preservation seriously at that time. And they would have lost these buildings if it wasn't for their ordinance. So you have a lot of power in the ordinance. Really trying to understand the enabling legislation that you're acting independently of the enabling legislation to permit, and then you have to decide. You have a lot of power. The last thing I want to talk about was guidelines. A lot of districts have guidelines. There are a lot of guidelines out there. Cribs on together. Detroit has, every district has their own guidelines, has what colors you can use, it's really strict. They have a really population that really doesn't understand it, so it's a lot of it's an educational background. But it's not necessary to do it just with the same. And that.
Thank you for a very informative refresher course.
I hope that helps
Yeah.
out.
What's your
So-
name again?
What's that?
What's your name again?
Liz, L-I-S, K-N-I-V-E.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. That was a wonderful presentation.